Hi, I'm Kemp Clark T. Sapudalo. For this video, we talk about the revised quarantine rules and regulations. Oh, what is revised quarantine rules and regulation?
An act strengthening the
Requirements
regulatory
of vessels to
capacity
be
of the
inspected.
Department of
It is
Health
vessels
and
clear.
Quarantine
Requirements for
International
vessels coming
Health
from
Surveillance,
requirements for
dealing for the
the
purpose
maritime
of
other documents deemed free pratique, provisional pratique, quarantine or vessel with cargoes containing hazardous materials, biological, chemical or radiological waste, etc. Expired Durating exemption certificate of vessel suspected of having been exposed to a radiological, chemical or biological repeat incident. Control-free plat, control-free pratique, direct berthing privilege. A pratique granted to vessels with a request for a direct berthing privilege submitted within 48 hours prior to the estimated time of arrival ETA, duly signed or certified by the master of TH. There has been no death on board during the voyage. Ports visited during the voyage should be stated in the request that no infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease, and or any public health emergency of international concern is present or endemic at the ports of origin. There is no sick person on board, nor was there any case of infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease, and or any public health emergency of international concern during the voyage. There has been no deaths nor illnesses among captive animals and birds, including rodents, on board during the voyage. The Durating exemption certificate is valid. Radio pratique is a pratique granted to military vessels of the Republic of the Philippines and foreign countries under the following conditions. There should be a ship surgeon on board or in any of the vessels operating as a squadron. The ports visited during the voyage should be stated in the request that no infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease, and or any public health emergency of international concern is present or endemic at ports of origins. There is no sick person on board, nor was there any case of infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease, and or any public. The Durating exemption certificate is valid. Controlled radio pratique is a pratique granted to cruise vessels under the following conditions. There should be a ship surgeon physician on board. The request for controlled radio pratique shall be submitted to the Bureau within 48 hours before the estimated time of arrival ETA. The ports visited during the voyage should be stated in the request that no infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease, and or public health emergency of international concern is present or endemic at the ports of origin. There should be no actual or suspected case on board of an infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease, or a public health emergency of international concern. The quarantine medical personnel shall board the vessel at the anchorage and conduct quarantine inspection while the vessel is slowly proceeding towards the port. Immunization certificate requirement. Yellow fever. The director of quarantine may from time to time prescribe or require immunization from certain diseases if in his discretion such requirements are essential on account of varying public health condition. Other vaccinations may be administered upon request. State of health of the passengers and crew. Existence or non-existence of an infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease, and or a public health emergency of international concern from the port of origin or other previous ports. Call sanitary conditions on board, validity of the Durating exemption certificate, and state of rat life on board, and type and tonnage of cargo. Boarding a vessel from foreign ports placed under quarantine. In case of notification of the presence of suspected cases of infectious diseases subject to the regulations, emerging disease, and or public health emergency of international concern, and or death on board. No person is allowed to embark except the quarantine medical officer and or his duly accredited assistants. Disembarkation of the passengers and crew is not allowed until such time that the vessel has been granted a quarantine clearance. Suspected cases shall be medically evaluated on board and transported to a designated referral hospital for isolation. Crew and passengers who may be possibly exposed to an infectious disease, emerging disease, and or public health emergency of international concern may be isolated or undergo voluntary home confinement. Any person who boarded a vessel under quarantine without the permission shall be subjected to detention and quarantine. In cases when the vessel is exposed to radiological, biological, or chemical terrorism, the tailored actions on such incidents should be followed in accordance to the interim guidelines on preparedness. Requirements of vessels before departure. No vessel shall be allowed to depart from any seaport of the Philippines to foreign destination without securing an outgoing quarantine clearance from the director of quarantine or his duly authorized representative. Clearance shall be granted to the vessel on condition that such a vessel has observed all quarantine requirements imposed. This clearance shall be a requirement for the granting of a customs clearance for departure. Embarkation of travelers for international voyage. The director of quarantine, when he considers it necessary, may order the medical examination of travelers and may disallow of any suspected person having an infectious disease subject to the regulations. Emerging disease, and a public health emergency of international concern from embarking on an international voyage except in case of the transport of sick persons by a conveyance especially provided. The purpose, in order to safeguard the health of the passenger and crew. The quarantine inspection of vessels shall be conducted by the quarantine medical officer and/or a duly accredited assistant designated by the director of quarantine, in seaport where there is no. A quarantine medical officer, a duly trained physician, will be designated by the Undersecretary of Health as acting or alternate quarantine medical officer upon the recommendation of the director of quarantine, who shall perform such function on an annual contractual basis. Time of vessel quarantine inspection. Inspection of vessels required by these regulations shall be made between Mondays to Fridays. Any inspection performed outside of these hours and during Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays shall be compensated for. Hence, reasonable reimbursement by the concerned shipping company may be allowed by the director of quarantine in relation to the incurred expenses and services rendered.
Requirements of vessels. Rat guards and mooring connection lines at the vessel docks alongside the piers. All mooring lines shall be provided with prescribed rat guards not less than 1 meter in diameter and so fixed. The peel is at right angle to the line to which it is attached. Distance of vessel from the dock. All vessels should fend off at least 1 1/2 meters from the dock. Mooring a vessel to another vessel which is moored to a dock. A vessel which shall tie alongside another vessel moored to a dock shall institute all necessary measures to prevent the access of rats from one vessel to another. Disposal of garbage. No vessel shall be allowed to dump garbage or waste overboard while in the harbor. Garbage should be collected in prescribed containers for disposal when a vessel is in port. Arrangements should be made for the regular removal of garbage by a disposal service in accordance with the environmental and health provisions of waste disposal to ensure that it is properly collected, treated, and disposed of in accordance with existing standards and laws. Rat inspection of vessels. Vessels without derating exemption certificate. Vessels with expired derating exemption certificate. Vessels with valid derating exemption certificate but with moderate to heavy rat infestation aboard or have visited plague-infected ports. Any inspection for rat infestation shall be under supervision of the quarantine medical officer, and all findings shall be recorded in the derating inspection form. Derating measures shall be conducted. Depending on the degree of rat infestation, and a corresponding certificate will be issued. Kinds of derating certificate. Derating certificate. A certificate being issued after a derating measure has been performed, such as fumigation or rat poisoning and trapping, which is valid for 6 months from the date of issuance. Derating exemption certificate. A certificate being issued when there is no evidence of rat infestation on board and is valid for 6 months from the date of issuance. Extension certificate. A certificate being issued which shall be valid for 1 month from the date of issuance, with instruction that formal inspection and issuance of a derating exemptions. Certificate shall be done in an export authorized to conduct such inspection and issuance of certificate. The certificate can only be issued once. Vessel must have a valid derating certificate or an extension certificate upon arrival and prior to departure. Fumigation. The following are subject to fumigation while in the harbor: any vessel with human or rodent plague on board, any vessel moderately or heavily infested with rats or other pests and vermins. Cargoes in a vessel from a plague-infected port which are vulnerable to harbor rats and fleas. However, if the cargo is covered by a valid certificate of fumigation from the port of loading, fumigation may be waived subject to the verification of the authenticity of the certification. Trolling vessels for their periodic annual...
Then I'll thank you. Have a nice day.